immediately sense differences in the account, the Marusic account, and the Garrett account
Okay.
of Hume. And I can think of a couple of things that are significantly different, but maybe you might help say something further about it and explain that further to what extent you think there might be a difference. But
Okay.
it seems to me you do not necessarily rely on or need direct and indirect or certain things, or you don't need necessarily certain notions about conceptualization of abstract ideas. So in your account, you don't rely on them. And then you also introduce the genetic account, which seems to suggest there's maybe something more or less needed to really understand you. You need the genetic account. That's very
okay.
critical.
Good. So the question is, what do I disagree? Where do I disagree on you? Okay. Good first question. So, I mean, I think so. I haven't said anything about how we get a sort of abstract concept of cause, right? So I'm just trying to figure out how do we get the idea of necessary connection. What does Hume think that idea is, right? So I think a lot of what Don was saying this morning is in a way compatible with what I want to say, because he's sort of answering a different question: how do we get the concept? So I do think maybe I think that when Hume talks about clarifying what we mean by cause, right? He thinks that like a very large part of the work involved in doing that is done just by figuring out what the idea of necessary connection is, right? He doesn't say much. And there's one paragraph in that section of the treatise where he talks a little bit about abstract ideas, but he doesn't say a lot about abstract ideas. So I do think that he thinks that somehow locating the right kind of experience, right? So this is Hume, not Tom. That Hume thinks that locating the right kind of experience does a lot of the work in explaining what we mean by cause. And that he sort of thinks that we don't, he doesn't seem to think that we need to say a lot about abstraction. So I do think that in a way what I'm saying is I hope mostly compatible with Don, but I want to emphasize more the sort of genetic account and trying to figure out like what the idea is, and then I don't think that it's as central to the story I want to tell that he has to sort of go on and give an account of abstraction. I will say that I don't think that it's totally obvious how you get from clarifying what the idea of necessary connection is to what say the truth conditions of causal assertions are. And I haven't said anything about that, right? Like how do you get from, suppose we've settled what the idea is, now how do we specify what the truth conditions of causal assertions are? Hume seems to think, I mean, he doesn't say anything really about language, right? So he seems to think that it's kind of straightforward, but he doesn't actually like lay it out for us. And I haven't done it either. Does that sort of help?
Yeah, no, and I wonder if on your account, or maybe whether there's a clear distinction now between conditions and cause.
Between conditions and causes?
Yeah, conditions and cause. Also conditions and cause.
Do I think that there's a clear, I mean.
Well, in your account, it seems less clear to me how you might be able to distinguish between those two things.
So, it would be nice if that's true. I'm not sure that I see how my account makes that distinction. I mean, I do think that it's responding to a constant conjunction of events or objects involved in events that leads you to form causal judgments. So if you can tell me how my account makes possible a distinction between causes and conditions, I guess that would be great, but I'm not sure I see.
No, I thought that maybe the account you gave of Hume was such that it wasn't clear necessarily how one would make the distinction between a mere causal condition and a cause.
So that, I mean, I don't think that Hume has a robust distinction between a causal condition and a cause, right? Right? In either case, right, what we're responding to when we get the impression of necessary connection is just experience of constant conjunction, right? So I don't think there's a strong distinction between conditions and causes.
trying to wrap my mind around what you mean by saying that, sorry, I can't see my pen, that causation is mind dependent.
Okay,
So I'm just
yeah.
trying to get what you
Yeah.
mean by that. So it seems like you mean something like the necessary connection is this mental transition.
Yeah.
It's a mental transition. And so if necessary connection is a mental transition, then it could only occur in agents, right, or in minds.
Mhm.
And so what follows from that, though? Is it the case that causation is then only agent causation? in
No,
a kind of way?
no. So one thing that I really, I want to try to show how Hume can think both that causal necessity is mind dependent, but without that implying any kind of asymmetry between mental and non-mental causation, right? So he really does think that anything can be a cause, not just that agents can be causes or God or, right, anything can be a cause. So, so part of the trick, right, is to say, well, look, how can it be that he thinks causal necessity just is a kind of transition and yet not hold that there's a kind of asymmetry between mental and non-mental causation, right? And I think the answer just is whether the causes and effects are mental or non-mental, either way, right, a necessary connection holds between two events, right, if there's the right kind of connection or transition between the representations of those events in an observer's mind. And that's true of stuff in the world, right, billiard balls, and also true of mental events as well. So there's a symmetry there.
So there is necessary connection in the world.
Well, so you have to be careful. I think that events are necessarily connected, right? They're necessarily connected in virtue of the right kinds of transitions occurring in people's minds, right? So if you say, when you say there's necessary connections in the world, that makes it sound like, well, the necessary connection holds in virtue of sort of objective or intrinsic features of the events, and that's what I think Hume thinks, no, that's not right. But still, one billiard ball is necessarily connected with the movement of another, but in virtue of something that happens in an observer's mind, not in virtue of...
So just, this is my last follow-up. So
Yeah.
is a way to think about this, that sort of necessary connection is like a secondary property? It's like color or something like that?
I think, so this would make me, again, very close to Don, right? I think, of course, depending on how you understand secondary qualities, right? I think I want to resist saying that there's a sense in which a necessary connection just is, for Hume, constant conjunction. I know that there's some textual evidence for that, but I think, so I do want to say that he thinks that no necessary connections really are impressions, determination of minds, transitions, but that's all mental stuff, right? But nevertheless, it's in virtue of that mental stuff that we can say that events in the world are necessarily connected.
Thank you.
So this is also a question of whether there's differences in our views.
Okay,
And I
good.
accept that you talk about some different things that I do and vice versa. And this is directly relevant to it. So I guess the question in a way is whether you agree with the systematic Lockean ambiguity
Yeah.
notion or not. So it's notable that when you say Hume thinks the negative semantic conclusion established because our idea of necessary connection is the idea of whatever it is that repeated experience produces or discovers.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm totally convinced by your account of what the argument is, why Hume's saying what he's saying about power being in the mind.
Okay.
One thing that repeated experience produces or discovers is, of course, constant conjunction, which it discovers. And likewise, the guiding thought that he's looking for something that helps explain how we make inferences about things we do not immediately observe. Constant conjunction helps explain how we make inferences about things we do not immediately observe.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something in the clause you just gave. You mentioned there are no intrinsic necessary connections in nature. What we're not finding is something in the very cause and effect themselves which grounds this, the individual cause and effect themselves which grounds this inference or is discovered. So you mentioned there are passages like this multiplicity of resembling instances constitutes the very essence of power or connection.
Yeah.
So, do you
right,
want to explain away
that's-
that evidence, or do you want to say?
Well, I
how
don't.
he's
I
really
hope that it's not
systematically-
explaining away, but
Yeah.
so he does say that, right? But he
Yeah.
says it. I think it's like paragraph. Is it 15? I think. Anyway, so I think he's saying that right when he's looking for something further, right? So I think he says, look, there's this multiplicity of resembling instances, and I think that I want to read that as a sort of expression of the thought that whatever necessary connection is, it has to be somehow closely connected with the kind of experience that gives rise to inference, right? So I don't take that as being a claim, look, what necessity is just multiplicity, it is just constant conjunction, but that it's really an expression of the thought that whatever it is that's somehow the foundation of our inferences, right? That it's this, that's responsible for our making and seems to justify our making these inferences. It's got to be closely connected with the multiplicity of what's the phrase? Multiplicity of resembling instances or something. So I do take it that that's not a statement of a sort of strict identity. I think that the sort of four identity claims that I give really are, like, he really thinks that he's identifying those things. But that one, I think, in context, doesn't look to me like the claim that necessity just is. I do think that he thinks when you look at intrinsic sort of what's true in the world, sort of objectively, right? Like, what are the intrinsic properties of events? Then I think it's right to say, well, what there is just constant conjunction, right? Now, I'm not sure whether I want to say that then you get a kind of Lockean ambiguity. It seems right to me, it's true that we have this kind of response to constant conjunction. But I'm not sure that then I think Hume thinks that we want to say that what constant conjunction is both the thing we're responding to and the response, or that there's an ambiguity, right, between the thing we're responding to and the kind of response. I think he thinks.
Those are two different things. That's right.
Yeah.
The question is
whether
the
there's
term
an
is ambiguous between the
no,
two.
I think that
Can be used
he
either way.
wants to say a necessary connection is the response, right? But it is true that that's what we're responding to.
Mhm.
So maybe it's just
So it is a difference.
I think so.
And
Yeah.
unlike the impression is blue, and also the body is blue as long as it produces the impression of blue in us. That would be the
Right, that's right.
ambiguity case.
Well, I mean, yeah, I should stop there. Yeah. I'll say something, yeah, but I think that.
Jerry, was that a follow-up or was that a?
No.
Eli?
Well, maybe there's a follow-up.
Two fingers.
Just very quickly, if you would clarify things to talk about something being an object of attention. My pen is an object of attention, even though it's only an object of attention because of something going on in my mind.
Yeah.
So you might talk about distinguishability as a feature in the object, but being an object of attention is like being a necessary connection.
Yeah. Right. So.
There's nothing mysterious about object
Right.
of attention.
So when Hume says, "Look, it's nothing in the world," I take him to mean something like it's not something that's like it's just like the attention isn't somehow intrinsic to your pen. Your pen is an object of attention in virtue of your paying attention to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my view. But and there's no asymmetry, right? You can pay attention to mental stuff and you can pay attention
Right.
to physical stuff. It's you can give the same account, right? So that I think is really important to me. I don't want to say that Hume thinks that there's some kind of difference between mental and non-mental causation. That I think that's really important.
Eli?
Yeah, so I'm very interested in the idea, if I understand you, that according to you, there's a distinctive kind of experience of the transition.
Yeah.
I was just teaching the investigations, and Wittgenstein is trying to figure out, is there some distinctive experience of the transition from seeing a word and then saying the word?
Yeah.
And Wittgenstein also said he couldn't bear to read Hume.
Because of that.
So kids, I think of one other kid, but
Yeah.
neither one of them caused the other.
Right.
So is that a different type of transition?
Okay, good. No, so Hume thinks that there are these sort of three natural relations, right? And so he does think, if you think of something, you'll think of something resembling it. That could be, kids find resemble, so that might be it. Or you think of something contiguous, or you think of something's cause or effect. And those are all kind of natural relations, right? Things naturally direct your thought to something else. He thinks that it's only the relation of causation that actually grounds inferences about things that you don't observe, right? So resemblance and contiguity can't ground inferences. And I think that's why he thinks causation is a kind of special relation, right? Causation is sort of cognitively really important because it's what enables us to make these inferences. So I do think that he has a causal inference does have a different kind of felt character than just thinking of one of your daughters and then thinking of the other.
That has a different felt character?
I think it's so I have kind of a crazy view about this, which I left out of the paper, but I think it's not sort of radically different in kind, but that it's sort of different in degree. So I think most people think when Hume talks about the feeling of determination or the felt determination that it seems like it's a feeling of like being forced or compelled. And I actually think that Hume thinks it's a kind of feeling of ease or facility in like moving from one idea to the other. I haven't really persuaded a lot of people that Hume thinks that that's true, so I decided to make that as a paper. But I do, so if that's right, I think that the difference between, there is a kind of like ease or facility, right, in thinking of one of your daughters and then you just naturally, easily start thinking of the other one, right? But I think it's less kind of natural and easy than thinking of one billiard ball moving and then thinking of the other. So I would say they belong in the same family, but still there's a different kind of, a different degree of the kind of ease or facility in a causal inference.
Is that a thought? Did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, but Jennifer answered what I was going to ask about.
Okay.
You mentioned that part of your solution was that the idea of giving way to A and B was not, of A giving way to B
Yeah.
was no different from the idea of A and the idea of B.
Yeah.
But it feels like you're just helping yourself to something much too easy there.
Okay.
Humans. It just seems like the giving way, I can have an idea of A,
Yeah.
and I can have an idea of B, and I can have no idea of giving way. I can have a full-blown idea of A and a full-blown idea of B and no giving way.
Yeah.
So how is that the case?
Okay, good. So since I already said that I have this kind of unorthodox view that the feeling is really a feeling kind of ease or facility, I'm gonna now help myself to that. So I have a kind of here's an analogy, right? So it seems to me like if you think about something that you do habitually, right? So my example is skiing. If you're a good skier, right, like and you ski with ease or facility, there's a difference between sort of the way one motion kind of flows into the next one, right? Even if you think, look, first I like lean to the right and I put my pole down and I don't know, I'm actually not that good a skier. And then I like lean to the other way. So there's the motions, but there's a difference in the way those motions kind of connect up in someone who does it with facility. And it's different than like, someone who's a terrible skier. Me, when I was learning how to ski, I said, okay, like, pole, plant, lean to the right, lean to the left, pole, plant, right, where it's all choppy, right? And so my thought is there's a kind of mental equivalent of that, right? Things can flow together when you practice them, and there's a kind of ease, right? One thing just goes into the next. And then there's a difference when it can be sort of choppy. And so...
But doesn't your example make it seem like that the two different connected states in each of the are different? So but for your example, it doesn't have to be the A and B are the same in both cases.
No, so I do want to say they're different. So the perceptions do have a kind of different feeling to them, right? So just like Hume thinks that sort of force and vivacity are kind of feelings that perceptions can have in varying degrees. I think that he thinks that there are other kinds of feelings that can be characteristics of perceptions, and when you have a sort of when you make the right kind of transition, when you have a customary transition, there's a kind of feeling that characterizes that transition that doesn't characterize other kinds of transitions. So, but it's something analogous to force and vivacity. It is a kind of property of the perceptions, a quality of the perceptions, I should say. Does that kind of help? So I do think that he does say, right, that perceptions, he thinks that, so at one point he says that force and vivacity seems to be the only such feeling of perceptions, and then in the appendix he takes it back and he says, gosh, I should have said that there are other feelings that characterize perceptions. And so he doesn't say what those other feelings are. My suggestion is that one of them is the impression of necessary connection.
I'll have to think about it.
Oh, so causal necessity is this felt transition happening in the mind, and I'm just wondering, should we be understanding causal necessity as in its full-blown sense here? It seems like, maybe we shouldn't, because I feel like Hume as a psychologist is going to look at someone, and this person sees two events and attributes causal necessity between them.
Yeah.
And I think he's going to vindicate that attribution, maybe, and at the same time recognize that that person maybe can still conceive of a B without an A, so maybe.
Okay, so why is this necessity? Yeah. Okay, good. So I don't think, right, so I do think there's a difference between causal necessity and sort of metaphysical necessity, or whatever kind of necessity is tracked by conceivability, right? Because you can, I think, conceive of the cause not being followed by the effect, right? But it's sort of psychologically difficult, and it may be impossible to believe that the cause will occur without being followed, right? To believe that it won't be followed by the effect. So I do think that that it is a different kind of necessity, right? And that but I think that's okay, right? I think he thinks, look, the kind of necessity that holds between causes and effects isn't the same kind of necessity it's not the same kind of necessity that, say, characterizes geometry or something, right? Or metaphysical logical truths. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
I got back in the queue with a different
Yeah.
question. So I just wanted to ask you briefly about the relationship between the determination of the mind and the transition.
Okay.
So it seemed as though they have to be identical also.
Yeah.
And I agree with your point that determination doesn't have to be a causal locution. And
Yeah.
talking about occasionalism, there's a point where he says, according to the occasionalist, when something happens in the world that determines God to perform a volition, which presumably doesn't.
Yeah.
And it
God
causes
is not
God
caused.
to
Yeah,
perform
that
a
would be
role,
bad.
and
Good.
sort of occasionalism that view.
Good.
But the way he characterizes the determination, it's not the determination to the belief. It's the determination to carry the thought from the first idea to the second idea. So it seems like it's the determination to the transition. So if the determination is the transition, then it seems like it's the determination to itself, and that's the bit I still don't.
The determination. So it's the determination to carry the thought from
one to
idea
the other, yeah.
Okay. So I still.
This is, as it were, an objection to Hume, of course, not just to you. But I mean, yeah.
So. I mean, so I think that there is a. Well, I don't want to say it's a problem, but so he also says, right, that the customary transition, right, is the foundation of our inference. You might think, well, wait, the customary transition just is the inference, and I'm saying foundation is something like gives us reason to make the inference. So So it looks like there's a similar problem there, right? How can the customary transition be the foundation of the inference and the determination? It looks like it's the determination to make it, so, and all these things get mushed together. So, okay, so what do I want to say? I think that there's a sense in which Hume thinks it is, so this is to answer the second problem, and then I'll come back to the first one, that it is the customary, that it's okay to say that the customary transition is sort of responsible for your making inference, partly because it's what that transition is like, right? That explains why you get that idea and why you then believe it. And I want to say that the same thing is true then of the determination, right? That the mind, like when you have a habit, you are, it's the habit is the determination. It's the thing that makes your thought determinate. Now, you say, well, it's the determination to make the.
So that makes it sound a little bit like having the customary disposition is
Yeah.
the impression. That is, that there's a feeling that the being customarily disposed has, which seems like it's still different from the feeling that actually I get when I actually go from one to the other.
Well, so I don't want to say that there's not going to be like a disposition that, right? If there's a disposition, it can't be something that's experienced. I also think it can't be the cause. So if there's a disposition, it's not what's causing you to make.
Like my being accustomed. That's the,
Yes,
yeah.
right. But so I think what I actually want to say is that the first perception when you make the inference has some kind of, through repetition, it acquires some kind of quality that explains, right, and leads you to make this transition. And that is part of, right, so you have like some quality of the first perception that leads you to make this transition, and you get the second perception. And so that quality is actually part of this whole impression of necessary connection, right? It's part of the whole package. But it's also true that that quality is part of what causes you to make this transition and makes the thought determinate, right? So that whatever that sort of felt character of that first perception is, it is the cause of the transition. And I think that it's okay to say that is kind of the determination to make the transition too, right? It's what makes the thought determinate, what sort of sends your mind on the path that it's going to follow, right? So
where I've got the two perceptions, it sounds like the determination is a feature of just the first, and the transition is a feature of the complex.
Yeah, so it sounds, right, so if I say that, then it looks like it's not like, I still maybe have to like say it's not strictly identical, and maybe that's the best that I can do. And I would like for them to, but it's true that, so I do think that there's a sort of distinction between necessary connection and power, and that this idea that, look, there's some feature of the first perception, and that's power, right? Because power has to be a feature of the cause, and then there's a difference between that and necessary connection, which is a relation. So what I want to say is, look, when you think about the sort of whatever this experience is, the part of it of just the cause, that's power. The part of it of the whole transition, that's necessary connection. That's what the connection is. So I do think there's that ambiguity, and maybe that ambiguity leads to sort of further question. Well, maybe the determination is really more like power, and necessary connection is more like this transition. So that might help. The details do get kind of tricky.
Hume explicitly categorizes this determination of the mind, or the customary transition,
Yeah.
in the case of causal references, as one among other associative transitions.
Yeah.
It's an associative relation.
Yeah.
And it looks to me like he attributes the same phenomenal quality to the distinct types of associative relations, such that whenever I kind of habitually think of a friend after seeing someone who resembles him or her, that transition from one impression to the thought will have the same phenomenological characteristics as it will if I see some cause and anticipate an effect.
Yeah. to be distinctive, but I think it can still be. I think it's still similar to the kinds of sort of phenomenal character of other transitions. But it is have to be distinctive, right? There has to be a difference between making an inference, right, and Eli's example of thinking of one of his daughters and then thinking of the other, right? But I do think that it's okay if there's a kind of similarity between what it's like to think of, one of your daughters and then naturally think of the other, and think of one billiard ball striking another and thinking of the second one moving. But the second one is going to be distinctive, right? It's not exactly the same as the first. Right?
It's phenomenologically distinct?
Yes.
Okay.
I do want to say that, yes. But I'm okay with the distinction just being one of degree. But nothing I've said, the paper doesn't turn on that, but I think it's okay if it's just one of degree. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Oh, yeah.
So thanks, I'm going to try this again with the thing that struck me. Although maybe you already answered it, so please forgive me. So on the one hand, there's constant conjunctions, and there would be constant conjunctions whether there were any minds or not. Is this true?
Yeah. Well, I do think that judgments about resemblance for Hume ultimately might be mind dependent too, right? So we say, well, it's true, but whether there's constant conjunction depends on which events we think are resembling and how we classify events. And I think that Hume is willing to allow that to a large degree. Whether events are resembling is really just a question of whether you take them to be resembling.
But you do want to make a distinction between there being one billiard ball communicating motion to another, right? And this is a sort of constant conjunction, and where the causation is, right? Where the necessary connection is, right? You do want to say that Hume thinks it's mind dependent, right? And it's not.
Well, the necessity is, right? But the constant conjunction, right? So.
Exactly. So that's what
yes.
I mean. So the necessity is somewhere else. It's not there in the necessary, in the constant conjunction. It's somewhere else.
Yeah, it's somewhere else in the sense that it holds between the events just in virtue of how you represent them. Yeah.
So it's somewhere else, and namely it's in the mind.
Yes. Right. When Hume talks about these sort of spatial locutions are like really natural, but I think that maybe they're a little loose, right? Because they do suggest, look, there's really necessary connections in here, and there's none out there, and I think that's not what Hume is really trying to say, right? He's trying to say, no. The necessary connection between any cause and its effect is really just in virtue of how an observer represents.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to push on the distinction between are there necessary connections only in the mind or only in the world.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm trying to push on.
Yeah.
I'm really trying to push on this idea that, to go back to the claim about occasionalists also think there are constant conjunctions.
Yeah.
And they also think there's causation, but the causation's not in the constant conjunctions, it's somewhere else.
Right.
So you seem to want to be saying something like that too.
Ah.
Right? But they would say where the causation really is in God's mind. And you want to say, or God's will. And you want to say, well, where the causation really is in our mind. Not in the sense that we are making it happen the way God's making it happen. Right? But in the sense that, see what I mean?
Yeah. So it makes it look like what I say that what follows from the view is that actually our minds are the causes of everything.
Well, no, I don't think you were trying to say that, but I think you
But
want, your view is sort of like theirs in the way that you want to take the necessary connection out of the constant conjunction and put it somewhere else, and they want to do that too, but you want to do it in a different sort of way. You don't want to do it the way they're doing it. But
for the occasionalist, right? You want to say, well, the occasional cause isn't a real cause, right? It's just occasional cause. God, though, is a real cause, right? But I don't think that I'm taking the necessary connection out of the cause in the same way, right? Because, it's not that we write for the occasionalist. It's like, look, the events; those aren't real causes. Those are just occasions for God to actually do something, right? But that's not the sense in which the necessary connection for Hume is sort of taken out of the causes, right? The sense is, one event really is causing another, right? And we think that they're necessarily connected, and they are necessarily connected, but in virtue of something that's in the mind of an observer. But I don't think that that's the same as saying that somehow the mind, that you're placing the necessary connection in the mind in the same way the occasionalist is placing the causal power in God. But I should clarify what exactly the difference is.
I mean, I don't think you're advancing an occasionalist view, but I think there's an interesting sort of.
Yeah, right, but I don't want it to sound like, I mean, I guess I would be worried if it made it, if it were too analogous to occasionalism, right? I don't want it to sound as if, look, the occasionalist takes the power of the object and puts it in God, and Hume takes it out of the object and puts it in us.
Right.
Like, that doesn't, it can't be in us in the same way that
It's
the
in God,
occasionalist thinks
right,
it's in
yeah.
God. Yeah.
Don reminded us of different epistemological, metaphysical, skeptical lines that are running through Hume. I'm just wondering, this idea that, the central idea you've spoken about, are we looking at, for Hume, a fact about human psychology? That there is no way to discover any causal connection between billiard balls
Okay.
as an intrinsic feature, or is it a feature of the theory of ideas, or is it a feature, is it a necessary, quasi-necessary truth for you?
So I think it's not just a feature of the theory of ideas. I mean, so I think that when Hume is interested in causation, right, I think he thinks that causation makes possible or explains a really important kind of achievement, right, that we can make inferences. And that his whole analysis of causation is like guided by the thought that whatever causation is, it's something that makes it possible for us to draw inferences about the unobserved. Now you might think, well, then causation is just a sort of quirk of our psychology, and he's not really telling us anything about.
But what would you say to could it be that dogs who can make certain sets of inferences, might their phenomenology be such that they are apprised of the causal connection in the things?
Okay, good, right. So this is really a question of like, could Hume, on my view, can Hume still be a kind of skeptical realist, right? For all we know, dogs or God or angels, they perceive real necessary connections
Is there a possible
in the world.
phenomenology that,
And I have, okay, so this is, it's a hard question, right? So a lot of the time, people who take Hume to be a kind of, some kind of skeptical realist, or to have a kind of realist conception of cause, they think that the thought that there really are sort of mind-independent necessary connections, that the content of that thought is not explained by the idea, the origin of which Hume is trying to explain in 1.3.14, right? And that's why we get this idea, well, look, you can have a relative idea, or sometimes people talk about like a bare idea or a bare supposition of some kind of causal necessity that goes beyond the whatever it is that the idea we have that Hume's explaining in 1.3.14 is. And I haven't said anything about like whether or not I think that's right about Hume. I tend not to think that is right about Hume, so I'm not super sympathetic with the kind of new Hume skeptical realist reading. But I haven't said that I think that Hume can't allow that there's a relative idea of necessary connection. I will say that I do think, so he says near the end of the section, he says, look, if you want to call some unknown quality of objects power or necessity, feel free, right? It'll be a little difference to the world, right? He says that. And so I think there what he's saying is something like, look, if you want to call some unknown feature of causes and effects power or necessity, like you're free to, but what he's interested in is something that explains a certain kind of cognitive achievement. And this unknown thing that's out in the world doesn't do that.
but to us it would be unknown. But in the same way that the dog can hear sounds that we can't hear,
Good.
domestic give an answer to the question.
Okay, good.
Could the dog have a distinctive
So you might think,
phenomenology?
okay, so what is this thing? And well, okay, so it's got to be something that if you knew about it would somehow seem to justify certain inferences. Okay, so I think, well, maybe I think what Hume's interested in is something that like at least seems to justify the actual inferences that we make, right? So that's why he says, look, necessary connections are the foundation of our inferences. He means our actual inferences. Now, it's true, maybe there's something out there that if you knew about it, it would ground some other, right? Like it would ground inferences that we can't in fact make because we don't know about it. So I think, I mean, I haven't said anything about that, but I am inclined to say that I think Hume wouldn't allow that there is such a thing. I mean, so if there were, right, if you, something, like there's something in the cause and if you knew about it, like you could, so why not think that somehow that thing could like, couldn't it just change its powers? Like, isn't it conceivable that like whatever that thing is, like it would have to be something that like it couldn't somehow, like, it's not even conceivable that it could change what it, like.
It would have to be an ancient or medieval idea of the effect being in the cause in some way.
So, okay, so if the effect,
But
so
Hume
I think it would
rejects
have to be, it would have to be something such that you couldn't, once you knew about that, you could no longer conceive of the effect not being followed by the cause. So it couldn't be any kind of like probable evidence, right? It would have to be something demonstrative, right? And I do think, I think this maybe Hume's closer to saying this in the inquiry than the treatise, but it seems to be like any of the kinds of features of objects that we're familiar with at all do not seem to be the kinds of things that are remotely like the kind of thing where look, you can't even sort of conceive of the cause without conceiving of the effect, right? It's inconceivable that the cause not be
Which is
followed.
language is part of the essence of the thing, that it causes X, Y.
I mean, so I will say, I mean, I guess I'm willing to give enough to the sort of new. I think that makes sense, right? On the face of it, like, I understand what you're saying when you say that. I think.
But the world is not that way.
Well, I mean, I'm not even sure. I think like, whatever that would be, it would have to be completely different from any of the kinds of features of objects that we're familiar with. And there, I think in Hume, yeah, if you want to call that power or necessity, it's a little consequence to the world, right? And then I think it's okay, right? He wants to say, look, I'm interested in the kind of thing that explains our actual inferential practices. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about causation and causal necessity. This other thing seems very mysterious, but he's not going to rule out that maybe that they're, I don't think he thinks dogs can, but I'm pretty sure about that.
Right. So I was surprised by your answer. I thought you gave way too much to the skeptical realist. I thought you wanted to say, look, you don't know what you're thinking when you're thinking that thought, and that falls out of the semantic empiricism.
Okay, so I think you don't, well, I don't know what you think. I think if you, I do think that in a way that came out, so I would say, look, what is this feature of objects that if you knew it, somehow there's some feature of the object that, like, if you could discover it, then you wouldn't even be able to conceive of the cause not being followed by the effect. Well, whatever that is, it has to be a totally different kind of thing than the observable qualities of objects, right? So in that sense, it's like, yeah, you can't really conceive, like, what would that be like, right? But I do think that maybe, like, I don't want to say that it's meaningless to say, yeah, there's something in the object such that if you knew about it, it would make possible some kind of demonstrative inference such that you could no longer conceive of the cause not being followed by the effect. That seems like that's all perfectly meaningful, right? Like, I feel like I can understand that, but I don't think there's any idea of that thing. Like, what is that feature? What's it like? What's of objects, anything we have an idea of.
If you're empiricist.
For Hume, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for Hume, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think this is just really clarification because I thought I was following what you said and now I can't remember how that went. Are you saying that, so 3 and 4 in Hume's model, causal necessity is an impression and causal necessity is a transition? Those are both true, the transition is the impression?
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, so how did that, so the thing, I can't reconstruct how that went now. So the thing that I'm worrying about is that it looks like they're just kind of separable, right? You could have the associative mechanism could work in you, but it just, there's no phenomenology, right? Your zombie twin,
Yep.
there's nothing that's like your zombie twin to
Okay.
have the transition.
Good. So, so this is something that like Stroud worries about. I think you've read that, right? That so, and I think that this is a kind of difference between what Stroud's view is and what I want to say, because I think Stroud thinks, look, the impression of necessary connection is just this feeling that you happen to get when you make certain inferences, but you can kind of imagine just like erasing that, and then you make the inferences, you form all the same beliefs, but you don't get that impression, and then it looks like, well, people who don't have this impression, they can make all the same inferences, but they somehow can't think thoughts about causal necessity. So I want to say, no, the impression really just is the experience of making this transition, right? And so you can't have the experience of making the transition without the transition. And the experience of making the transition really just is the transition itself. So you can't sort of erase the impression and still make an inference. So the thought is like, if you imagine that somehow we didn't have the impression of necessary connection, we wouldn't make inferences at all.
Oh, okay. So, all right.
So like without the impression, there's no inference happening. That's what I.
Okay, so now that makes sense to something that you said later on when you were talking about your other paper about which I was slightly puzzled by so the idea that the associative mechanism, like they all have a phenomenology associated with them that struck me as not obvious. So like something pops into your head, right? This happens to me all the time. Something pops into my head. Sometimes I realize that the reason it just popped into my head was that, I suddenly think of someone.
Yeah.
And I realize that's because I just walked past someone who looked quite like them, right? So it seems like there's no distinctive phenomenology except the phenomenology of something popping into my head. That's all the phenomenology.
Yeah, there's not.
Right? There's no kind of transition. So but you want to say that Hume is committed to thinking that in all of those cases there's a kind of an associated phenomenology, and indeed you want to say that stronger thing that in those cases as well the phenomenology is, as it were, part of the mechanism. Like you couldn't have the mechanism without phenomenology.
Yes. Well, so in the case of, I absolutely want to say that in the case of a causal inference that the phenomenology is distinct, right? It's distinctive. I think that it's okay to say that in other cases of natural relations there's a similar but not identical kind of phenomenology. So the thing popping into your head, and you think, well, there's no, but it does seem like, look, you saw someone and then boom, your thought is naturally carried to someone else, and it does seem like, look, it just happened sort of easily. Hume says I think it's in 138. He says that so the facility of transition is essential to the nature of relation, right? And I take him to mean that, right? That really that ideas, perceptions are related because of the facility of transition between them. And I do think that facility is at least partly phenomenological. Like we might not always notice it. It might not sort of kind of be obvious. And sometimes you might have to sort of think about it to notice it. But I do think that he thinks there's a difference between the way that ideas that are related kind of follow one another and the way that ideas that aren't naturally related follow one another.
And you want to say the reverse as well, so you want to say, well, you can actually, because they're identical, I guess. So you couldn't have whatever that phenomenology is with when you have the impression of necessary connection, you couldn't have that very phenomenology without having
say that the phenomenology is in a way, like it's the felt character of the transition that explains why you make the transition.
Because I suppose I'm just thinking about a case, but I don't know, so through education in the human sense, right, you learn that A's cause B's.
Okay.
Right, and now
So,
if it was an A, I believe that it, right, but that's
yeah.
the wrong mechanism.
Okay, good. No, so what I want to say, right, so I have a sort of, when I say that I think that the way to characterize the phenomenology is more as facility, which most people don't think is right? I mean, Wayne Maxim thinks that's true, but he's the only other person I know who thinks that that's right. So there's a kind of problem, right, which is that Hume appeals to facility a lot, right? He thinks that lots of mental stuff is characterized by facility or ease. And then the question is, well, how do you distinguish inferences from other kinds of facility? And so that's why I want to say that in a way the impression of necessary connection is kind of the whole package of having one perception followed in the right way by another perception, because that's what distinguishes the impression of necessary connection from, say, the kind of facility that characterizes transitions between perceptions in the case of belief in body, right? Because in that case you have facility, but you also have resemblance between the perceptions. So it's not just, the impression can't just be facility, it has to be the facility of the transition between perception of one thing, perception of other. And in a way, the impression of necessary connection has to be that whole thing. But the whole thing is different in character from other sets of. That's all?
Yeah.
So this may be a distant and eye inquiry, but one of the ways in which you were characterizing the relationship between necessary connections and the mind is that the necessary connections hold in virtue of the mind. And I wanted to hear a little more about this in virtue of relation, because it's typically taken to be a necessitation relation. So
Okay.
what does this mean?
Okay, good. Hold in virtue of, yeah. I think I'm okay with it being, I mean, right, our idea of necessary connection, right, is the idea of the customary transition, right? It is the idea of the perceptions being related in that way. And so I think it's okay to say, I mean, the necessity there isn't causal necessity, but I think if the idea is the idea of this kind of relation between the perceptions of events, then it does have a kind of necessity, right? That's just part of the content of the idea. Does that, I mean, so I'm not sure, I think it's okay to say that that's necessary. Right? If it just follows from what the idea is an idea of. Is there a problem? I see a lot of people are looking puzzled, but I think it's okay to say that.
I can't decide if I'm confused or.
I mean, you were right to say it's not causal necessity.
It's not causal necessity, but it's going to be, it would be sort of analytic, right? But that's okay.
Oh.
And that's a kind of necessity, but so it's true in virtue of meaning, because it's true in virtue of the content of the idea.
I don't have the exact wording, and so that hopefully you or Don or somebody would have it, because that may make my question irrelevant. Some letter, Hume says that he has never denied, and this is where the wording, that an event must have a cause, or whether it's a change must have a cause. I don't have the exact wording of that. Okay, he's talking there of, if I may describe it as backward causality, going from the effect, what is granted to be an effect, to a cause. We've been talking about forward-looking causality, but it seems to me if he was serious at that time, and I accept him as at the time he wrote that letter, what, the day before or not, or the day after, but at the time he wrote that letter, he was serious.
Yeah.
It blows the whole thing, because he's using a concept of cause which doesn't fit into these categories, because he's not saying that I'm granting interdependent relationship behind it. He's not saying that at all. And so he's, at that moment, trying to have it both ways. And I think that something that hasn't come up today, and very often just is assumed when we talk about Hume, that he was right in his argument that there's nothing in any object that gives us a reason to conclude to something beyond that object. That argument is valid, which I argue against, that it's not valid. But we take that for granted, because if that argument isn't correct, then you've got to have a different concept of causality than he comes up with.
Okay.
And so I think you also have to have a different concept at the time. Now his argument concerns epistemically necessary, whether the statement, whatever begins to exist has a cause, whether that's epistemically necessary. And that's not his, that's Crippy's way of putting it, but not his. But he is then in that letter saying, not denying his argument.
Yeah.
He still says it's not epistemically necessary, but it might be necessarily true. He's saying it, even though we don't know it's necessarily true, it might be necessarily true. But he's got to have a completely different concept of necessity, of causality, of everything else to seriously make that statement.
Okay, good. Maybe someone who has the internet can like look up the, I don't know if anyone knows which letter it is. But so I do think that Hume thinks that we believe that every event has a cause, right? And that I think he thinks that we should believe
But
that.
must have a cause.
Good. So now the trick is what do we mean by must,
Yeah.
right? Now I think that he thinks that if the must is something like metaphysical necessity, then I think this is controversial, but I think it's false, right? He thinks every event must have a cause. It's like metaphysically necessary that every event has a cause.
But he
It's false.
he admits at that point that he doesn't think it's false.
Well, so it depends on what the must means, right? I mean, I assume he doesn't say must in the sense of metaphysically, right? Because he does argue really clearly in Treatise 133, right, that it's conceivable that some event could happen uncaused. And if he believes that conceivability implies possibility, then it's possible. And so I think that he thinks that it's metaphysically possible that something could occur uncaused. When he says, look, it's
Okay, that's all right. No, that's an acceptable answer. But all I'm saying is that on that day, he was not thinking that.
well,
and whether he realized he was trying to have it both ways or not, I don't know. I think he was sincerely trying to have it both ways, maybe unconsciously and sincerely both trying to have it both ways.
I think he could, right? We could take the letter literally. We should look up what the exact wording is. But as long as we don't take must there to mean metaphysically necessary, then he could have really meant it, and he really could have it both ways, right? It's just the sense in which it's true that every event must have a cause is weaker than the sense than to say that it's metaphysically necessary that every event must have a cause.
And he's going to have a different concept of cause, it seems to me.
Or must.
Yeah.
I think it's the must, right? And I do think that he thinks that the word must is ambiguous, right? There's causal necessity and then there's metaphysical necessity.
We have time for one more question.
It's me.
So this is about the ease of the transition.
Okay, good.
And so you want to say that there's this phenomenologically distinct causal transitions have a phenomenological quality that other kinds of transitions don't, and you want to say it's facility or ease or something like that. So, so it seems to me that ease is going to admit of degrees, like some causal transitions are going to be easier than others.
Yeah.
And non-causal transitions can also be more easy than other non-causal transitions. So in other words, so I feel like it's going to need to be the case that there's some guarantee that for every one that we want to call a causal transition, the scale of easiness is all going to be up here,
higher,
and all the non-causal ones are going to be down here. And I don't see, I'm worried that there's no guarantee that the upper bound of those non-causal ones are just going to overlap with the lower bound of the causal ones.
Yeah.
And so do you have a guarantee that won't happen?
Okay, good. Well, so this is partly why I want to say that the impression of necessary connection is like this whole package of the one perception and then the sort of easy transition to the second one. Because then it's not just a matter of like degrees of ease, right?
Yeah, right.
It's got to be, you also have to have the right kinds of perceptions, right? So I think, for example, it may be easier when you have, so Hume's example of like believing that a body continues to exist when not observed, right? That the transition between perceptions of like, say, this unchanging model, those transitions are even easier
Yes.
than in the case of a causal inference, plausibly. But they're still not the right kind of perceptions. So the whole package is different. So it may be that cases like, so Eli's example of like thinking of one of his daughters and then thinking of the other, if that were too easy, then that might be a problem.
Right. I see. So, okay, so this is kind of like the stuff you were saying to Helen earlier.
Yeah.
But I think, but earlier in Q&A, it sounded like you were saying to people that you'd be comfortable making it just a difference in degree, not in kind. And now it sounds like it's...
So I think the feeling could be just, but still the impression is, so I think you've got the perception of one event followed by the perception of other, and there is some kind of felt character to the transition. But for it to be an impression of necessary connection, it matters what the perceptions are, right? They have to be perceptions of two events, not of like an A followed by an A or something. But still, it could be similar to the example of like thinking of one of your daughters.
And once you have it narrowed down that way, you think that it's going to be it'll be a problem if some of those transitions are super easy and some of the causal ones are not that easy. But now it's not looking, once you narrow it down like that, it's going to be hard to come up with actual examples where it is super easy to have non-causal transitions of the right
I think that's right. So I do think, so the sort of standard view, right, is that instead of thinking of the impression as one of easiness or facility, it's like one of being forced. So, and that I do think that Hume thinks that when you sort of resist a habit, right, when you try to not do it, then you feel a kind of, he calls it sensible violence. So I do think that like trying to resist a habit is characterized by sensible violence, but it doesn't mean that actually acting in accordance with a habit involves any kind of sensible violence, right? But so I do think that like it's harder to resist thinking of one billiard ball striking another and the second billiard ball moving than it is hard to resist thinking of one of your daughters